record button. And I would like to welcome everyone to the fifth presentation in the Fall 2023 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. My name is Bradley Flam. I'm the Director of the Office of Sustainability. And even though I'm remote today, I am thrilled to be able to welcome you to this seminar series. Our office is proud to co-sponsor this series with the Office for Research and Sponsored Programs and the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. We have 5 more presentations in this series going through November 15th. So please plan on joining us every Wednesday at noon on Zoom or in 255A/B Psych Student Union. You can get the full program on the Office of Sustainability's homepage on our website. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Joey Miller.
Thanks. I never know how to handle things like this. I'm not real great at being formal either. And Brad, am I speaking at an okay volume? Okay. So yeah, thank you for showing up. Like, this has been super exciting. I've loved all the talks so far. I'm planning on keeping attending. So yeah, I appreciate your being here. This is my second year at Westchester. I'm in the philosophy department. Most of my research is on ethics broadly speaking, and then more recently, Indigenous philosophy and Indigenous conceptions of ethics. So before I get too far involved, I do want to signpost or note something. A lot of this is from research and things about my own tribe. And so I want to be careful not to overgeneralize. And even though I'll say things like Native American or Indigenous, there are plenty of freaking tribes to who I'm sure this stuff doesn't apply to. And some of these concepts are different and all that. But it's just a broad term because these things are common features among a bunch of different Native American frameworks and Indigenous systems, even though not all of them. So I just want to preface that. I wanted to also share what started my interest in this kind of question. So the topic is on Indigenous values and their place in sustainability. And at my institution I was teaching prior to being at Westchester, I had a student who is really eager and really ambitious. And we would meet weekly because she was really interested in environmental ethics and Indigenous philosophy. And we just had lots of conversations, and we were out getting coffee one time, and she was real upset because she didn't know what to do with some of the stuff we had been talking about. And so one of the questions she asked me was, how can I do anything with Indigenous values and these concepts we've been talking about if I'm not Indigenous? And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, I don't want to push on that cultural appropriation line and start acting as if I'm Indigenous, but I also don't know if it's possible for me to do anything with this information, given that some of these concepts are so foreign and they're from completely different worldviews and things like that. And I didn't say this, but in my head, I was like, oh shit, she's right. I don't know what I'm supposed to say in this situation. And so that's kind of broadly what the PowerPoint is about. So oh, there we go. So here's a real quick outline. Preface, I have no idea how long this will go for. So I don't know if you've all been to philosophy talks before, but sometimes they range from 5 minutes to 50, and then the emphasis is on discussion and questions afterwards as more like a communal thing. So if I only go for 20 minutes, I'm fine with that, and we can have discussion or whatnot, but yeah, I have no idea. But yeah, real quick outline. What I'm planning to do is first talk about why we should care about values when we're concerned about sustainability, why it's not just about practices and what we can do, but what role values play and why that should be one of the central focuses. And then after that, I want to focus on Indigenous values. So this is where most of my research comes in. I want to give some examples of key concepts, explain how they fit together, what a start of a ethical framework would look like in Indigenous philosophy. It does look like, and I want to contrast that with some trends that I've noticed in Western ethical frameworks. And then at the very end, I've got two like real quick arguments that I want to offer. One, I just called it a skeptical argument because I don't feel great about saying it. But the other one I'm hoping is more optimistic. And then it'll end with some like follow-up about why this is like an optimistic view and where we go from here. So that's kind of the plan. Real quick, the reason why I want to focus on aims is because I don't think this takes too much. I don't think there would be a lot of disagreement, but been wrong before. I think the aims are aims for sustainability, or our values that drive our push for sustainability are important because they not only affect the definitions that we come up with, also the practices. So like individually, what kinds of things we do are often motivated by the values that we have or the aims or like what our end goal is. And in the same way, those kinds of things help shape our definitions, which in turn shape our practices. So here, when I'm talking about aims, I'm talking about things you would say in response to the question, why care about sustainability? So I typically, any answer you provide to that question is going to be focused on values that we have, or values that you think people should have, or values that are shared, so on and so forth. And those are the things that I want to, as someone interested in ethics and philosophy, that's the thing that I want to kind of take to be the focus of the research and driving force behind these. Now, like I said, the reason that I take those to be important is not only do they influence practices, but they influence definitions, and definitions legally and just pragmatically also then have an effect on practices and standards we set up and what we can do to meet those and all that kind of stuff. So I take the aims here to be kind of the root or like the foundation of these further kinds of practices that we're striving for. And if we have a bad root or like bad aims, that can infect then the practices that we have and the definitions, and we can miss the mark or be aiming at the wrong thing entirely. So just as quick example of some definitions of sustainability, there's the Brundtland Commission, UN from 1987, defines sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Similar, slightly different, is the EPA's definition that they have on their website. Everything that we need for our survival and well-being depends either directly or indirectly on our natural environment. To pursue sustainability is to create and maintain the conditions under which humans and nature can exist in productive harmony to support present and future generations. So there's a couple of things that I want to point out with these definitions. So I've tried to bold and underline them. And most of this has to do with what I take to be the focus here is still very rooted in human interest, or it's very anthropocentric. And so here the concern for the UN definition is on future generations. Maybe they're incredibly progressive, and that means future generations of plant and animal life and ecosystems as well. I assume that's not the case. I assume it's just referencing humans to meet their own needs. And then the EPA's definition, there's a lot of reference to we and our, and this one seems a little different because it adds the humans and nature and mentions something about harmony to support past and future generations. So it still has that part at the end that seems to suggest that this is very anthropocentric, human-driven. Sustainability is about what is going to help us as humans live well, how we can manage our environment and surroundings to fit our desires, our capacity to live, so on and so forth. So the reason why I'm bringing these things up is I want to contrast these kinds of the anthropocentric concerns or very Western conceptions of values, and then explain how different sets of values or different ways of conceiving that can have different effects on how we characterize and what kind of definitions are offered. And when we do that, that would likely lead to then different practices and different kinds of things that we're emphasizing. So next, practices. I'm not going to go too much in this, but when the slides get posted, you can click on these and read more about yourself. But for the UN Sustainability Development Goals, they list 3 that are related to climate or sustainability actions. So it has to do with climate change, aquatic life, and just animal life on land and plant life and all that kind of stuff. And each one of those has different sets of actions or things that you can do that can be done and issues that are occurring in each one of those sects. For the EPA, they published a report that identifies ways that we can help buildings maintain certain kind of standards so that we're being sustainable. And then also frameworks for indicators. Are we meeting the standards? Are we doing what needs to be done? What are some warning signs and those kinds of things? But all these are offering suggestions for particular practices that will ideally help achieve the definition that we have of sustainability, which, as I mentioned, seems to be driven partly by the aims and the focus of human well-being and human-centric kind of stuff. Does that all make sense? Okay. One thing I've had students point this out to me. I ask, does that make sense a lot? So I'm going to preemptively apologize for that. All right. So given that these things are all related, I wanted to start at the root and focus on the aims and see what kinds of different things might happen if we had a different set of focuses. So as I mentioned, this is going to be mostly my tribe stuff. So I'm a member of Muskogee Nation. It's in Oklahoma, originally from the southeastern part of the United States, like Georgia border. But yeah, on the Trail of Tears got relocated. But these concepts are some that cut across a lot of different tribes. So the two concepts that I'm going to focus on are harmony and reciprocity. And I'm not going to be able to do this justice, but I just want to explain how those things fit together, and then how reciprocity can be used to further explain some other values. These are not like an exhaustive list of values, and it's not meant to cover everything, but these are just examples to explain how the system works. And then in doing that, I also want to cover like issues in talking about Indigenous values. I think there's some language issues and translation and cultural paradigms that are going to make some of this stuff difficult. But in Muskogee philosophy or Muskogee thought, the main emphasis for any action was achieving harmony. And so here's real quick background of the worldview. Everything that exists is like endued or endowed with some sort of energy. And then any interaction with things constitutes an exchange of energy. So even non-living things, like if I move my chair, there's been an energy exchange from me to the chair. And so there's this kind of equilibrium that we're aiming for that's never going to be fully achieved and settled. And so like doing the right and the good thing takes constant effort. And this is part of the reason why there is no solving ethics, is because it's a constantly changing and ongoing thing. And so anytime I have an interaction with something, that qualifies as an energy exchange. And the thought here is that for everything to live well, there needs to be a balance that we're aiming at or trying to achieve and how energy is exchanged. So this is partly why gift giving is such a big thing. Like if someone does something for you or exchanges a gift, you have to reciprocate and give something back, because if you don't, there's then an imbalance there that's been created, and that's going to contribute to disharmony, which is going to make it harder for everyone involved in these things to live. So another big tagline is we are all related, or everything is connected. Like if you read books on Indigenous thought or Indigenous activism, that's a common thing that you'll see in the first few chapters. And the idea here is that thing that I just mentioned, everything is connected by energy. And if we really take that seriously, that would guide actions a lot differently. So people who are in another country right now might not have an effect of me moving my pen like this much, but in somehow, some way, some slight chance, there is something going on there. And so I have to be very considerate, not just of the people in my immediate surroundings, but how certain actions can have a ripple effect and how they're going to affect both past and future generations. So given settler colonialism and what kinds of things are happened and are still happening, the concern here is for Indigenous people contemporarily to still enact these values and these systems in their own tribes, but to also then make sure that you're doing that in a way that honors past generations. So like my grandma has a set of values and a way of upbringing that I want to try and honor and hold on to as a way of honoring ancestors and stuff, but also with concern to future generations. And if I ignore any one of those aspects, future, past, immediate surroundings, larger surroundings, I take a risk on creating disharmony. And then that's just what bad means, is creating disharmony. So I have a weird analogy. I'm not sure this is going to work, but the way that I think about this is if you take an ethical framework to be something like a map, like if I'm walking in a new area and I've got a map of the area, that can tell me where certain landmarks are, and I can figure out how to get there and things. the map itself doesn't help me orient like where I am or which way I'm facing. So compasses can be really helpful because it can tell me then when we're like, am I facing north and where do I go there? So in this analogy, I take a map to be something like an ethical framework. The concept of reciprocity is something like a compass. And so one of the big values for a lot of indigenous systems is humility. We know so little about our surroundings and about ourselves and how to live that we kind of rely on these shortcuts to help us do the right thing. Reciprocity is one of those shortcuts. So if I want to achieve harmony, it is really hard. This is just me. I don't know how to offer gratitude or thanks for a tree for providing me with oxygen. And so if I'm trying to think like, how do I give back? How do I reciprocate that gift? I'm not sure. But as long as the aim is reciprocity, and then I'm doing some things like that. So if you've ever seen natives like put down tobacco or something or sprinkle it down, that's part of the thought is like tobacco is a very absorbent plant. And so when it's dried, you typically, again, just my tribe, you hold it like between your fingers, you say a prayer, and the thought was that it like soaks up the words, and then you drop it on the ground, and then the wind carries it around and carries those words. And that's like a way of praying to Mother Earth and to getting things to happen. Same with like smoke. So the reason you burn sage and cedar and sweetgrass and all these things is because the smoke was thought to carry words and prayers and wishes up into giver of life. And then that would be how you get things to like start happening. Given that it's so hard to navigate all these situations, those became acts of reciprocity. So the sprinkling down of tobacco was just kind of a thing like, we're going to do this. This is our way of expressing gratitude because we have no idea how to actually reciprocate with trees in most contexts. But if I take something from earth, like I'm picking some crop or something, I can at least offer a prayer and say thanks and lay down some tobacco. That act itself is a way of bringing about harmony or balance and making things more equal and making sure that equilibrium stays intact. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. Not sure saying cool is much better. So yeah, reciprocity is supposed to act something like a compass, whereas ethical frameworks are something like a map. And so we're striving for harmony. Reciprocity helps us to get there. Gratitude, humility, love, all these other kinds of values are taken to be those landmarks on the map. So there are plenty of cases like relationships that I have where I don't know how to appropriately express my love or express my gratitude or express my humility. Reciprocity can help me get to those in the same way that a compass can help orient me so I can use my map to get to those certain landmarks. And so a lot of the practices that are pretty traditional involving prayers and stuff, the emphasis was on expressing gratitude because as part of your character, if you don't go on expressing gratitude regularly, it's going to be bad for you and bad for everything around you. And same with humility. If you act on arrogance pretty regularly, bad shit's going to happen. And you just want to try and fight that as much as possible. All right, so I'm going to contrast that briefly with Western ethical frameworks. I do want to point out, I'm not sure how, oh, I can go back. Okay. I'm using the terms harmony and reciprocity. This is where things get a little weird. Those aren't terms in like Muskogee's language, my tribe's language. There is no direct translation. And so harmony often gets translated, I'm going to say the word, you don't have to know how to spell it. It's Edamaske Apikat, which translates roughly to living together peacefully or something like that. Reciprocity, I have no idea how to say that word. But it translates to something like an equal exchange between parties that benefits both parties. And so that's not a great way of like translating reciprocity, but there aren't words in the language that capture the same things that words in English mean. So this is part of the concern is when you do like cross-cultural philosophy, it involves translating words and concepts. But anytime you do that, you're running the risk of like misidentifying something. And also these concepts play important roles because they're connected to each other that they might not play in certain Western systems. So notice even the EPA's definition of sustainability had a mention of harmony in nature. But whether that's the same conception or harmony plays the same role in a Western framework that harmony would in an Indigenous framework, might be very different. And so if you have that as your aim, it very much depends on what framework you're using it in order to influence actions and stuff. So the contrast I want to draw with Western ethical frameworks, most of this comes from, I teach a lot of ethics courses here. So ethical theory, so Aristotle, Kant, John Stuart Mill, most of the emphasis there is on very anthropocentric concerns. Same thing in political philosophy, John Rawls, the emphasis was always on human well-being and what can we best do to manage nature. And any concern about the environment is often indirect. It's not concern for the environment for its own sake, but it's, I'm concerned for the environment because it's important for us. And so that's always then driving what kinds of actions and considerations we have. In recent years, I'm going to say the past like 2 decades, there's been a lot of interest in psychology and studying like moral cognition and decision making. And so psychologists have jumped on board and tried to characterize morality so that they can study what goes on in our brains when we're thinking through moral problems. And most often the time that the concept that they focus on is cooperation. So moral problems are really just cooperative problems. If there is no problem of cooperation, then there is no moral problem in existence. Does that make sense? So in other paper that I've got, I've tried to draw out the concern with that. If you make cooperation the focus of like your ethical framework, then part of the issue involved is cooperation by definition requires consent. If you don't have consent with something, it's not cooperation, it's coercion. Given that cooperation requires consent, it requires things that you're cooperating with to have the ability to consent. And in that case, maybe some higher, whatever that means, animals can do that, but it seems to automatically then limit the scope of morality to humans. And so the kinds of things that only get considered in a lot of these Western ethical frameworks are humans, because they're the only things capable of agency or higher thought. They are the only ones capable of consent, meaning they're the only ones capable of cooperation. And when you delimit morality like that, you've now suddenly lost all concern for non-human animals and the environment and ecosystems, and any concern that there is has to be indirect or somehow tied to human focus, human aims, and human well-being. And so for me, that's one of the big concerns and one of the big contrasts is when we're focused on harmony and reciprocity, I have relationships with everything, not just living things. So I have a relationship with the chair. I have to treat that with respect for a variety of reasons. Someone else might use this. It almost also might reflect bad character on my part if I just break shit constantly and I have no regard for other people or the things themselves. In Western frameworks, I'm not sure that we have the conceptual tools to explain why that kind of stuff is wrong if it doesn't negatively impact humans. And so if I can break a chair as much as I want and I can just buy a new one or replace it, what's the concern or harm? And for chairs, like maybe that doesn't matter much, but when we start doing that with the environment and with non-human animals, it gets to be more problematic. And it starts to become really hard then to balance concerns for economic development with natural preservation and things like that. And so that's what I take to be like some of the driving force behind a lot of the concerns, environmental concerns that we are going on that the UN had mentioned earlier, and one of the big contrasts with like Western philosophy or indigenous philosophy. So here are my 2 brief arguments for this. I'm going to start with the skepticism one, but here's the question that I wanted to try and answer. Is it possible for Westerners, I'm not great, and I'm not thrilled about that term, but I didn't know what, I thought it might be weirder if I put white people, and so that was my best reconciliation. Is it possible for Westerners to adopt or live with these indigenous values? So here's my brief argument. Premise 1, for Westerners to do this, to adopt or live according to these values, they'd have to remove those concepts from their context. And so if you see harmony and reciprocity and think, those are good things, I want to do that, you can't act on the indigenous versions of those because you're trying to incorporate them into a Western framework, and suddenly those concepts take on a different role and responsibility. When you do that, second premise, when you remove a concept from its context in which it developed and in which it's currently used, the meaning of that concept loses its meaning or its meaning is drastically altered. And third premise, when you do that, you can't adopt that particular concept anymore. You've got some sort of weird morphed new idea. And that might be better than not having that, but it's not the same as acting on that concept itself. So it's a sketchful argument. Therefore, Westerners can't adopt indigenous values. Conceptually, it's just not something that's possible if you don't come from that background and work within that frame, that ethical framework, in order to engage with moral problems. Second question, this is my more optimistic argument. If Westerners can't live or adopt these practices, what should they do? So if like hearing these kinds of things in your head, you're like reciprocity and harmony and humility and gratitude and all those things sound great. That's fantastic. Like those seem like good values. So if you support that and you have that good feeling, I think you can support Indigenous fights for sustainability and Indigenous justice. So part of the concern here is if you look at especially pipeline protests or destruction of rainforests in other countries, part of the main concern is that Indigenous people are putting up resistance movements and fights, and when you get too much white interference, you start to drown out the Indigenous voices and the Indigenous values and the Indigenous concerns. And so there's a big question about what qualifies as allyship and support for Indigenous movements, rather than just taking the mic, taking the podium, taking center stage, and kind of co-opting those kinds of movements. So first claim is, if these values are things that you support, then you should support Indigenous fights for sustainability and environmental justice. And that doesn't mean overtaking or overthrowing or co-opting. It means doing other things like providing resources, sharing information, becoming aware, those kinds of things, and allowing and doing things to help allow the Indigenous people to continue fighting. And if they reach out and ask for help, that's great, then do stuff, but don't want to run the risk there. Second premise, Westerners should adopt these values or should support these values. I'm assuming that if I talked about gratitude and humility, most people are like, yeah, those seem like good things. And so I don't know what sense there would be to not think these are good traits. It's just they play different conceptual roles in different frameworks. And so what counts as reciprocity within or reciprocity or humility or gratitude within a Western framework is going to look very different from what counts as reciprocity in an Indigenous framework. Yet you can still identify and say, that value, I would like to do that. I know I conceptually can't, because I kind of consider it like implicit bias. Like you might be the most staunch anti-racist, but like in your head, that shit's still there somehow. And no matter what you do, you can't escape a Western worldview if that's the culture you're surrounded with, you grew up in, all those kinds of things. But it doesn't stop you from being able to do things in the same way that with implicit biases, there are some things that I can do to make sure that they're not interfering. The hope is there are some things that you can do to support these kinds of values as they function within a different cultural or philosophical framework. That makes sense? So yeah, then conclusion follows. Westerners should support Indigenous fights for sustainability. So those were the two brief arguments I've offered. I'm going to try and end on something more optimistic, like follow up with the good argument. But I'm going to go through like a list of books that highlight Indigenous social movements for environmental concern. First book is Our History is the Future by Nick Estes. This is focused on the Dakota Access Pipeline, but it does a history of like why these movements have been ignored, how they develop, where they're going, and how even if these aren't in the news, this kind of stuff is always happening. So like, I don't hear as much about like the Pipeline 3 protests in Minneapolis as I did at Standing Rock and Dakota Access Pipeline, but that kind of stuff is still happening all the time. This is a just historical account about how this started and where these things are going. Another one, this might be my favorite one on here, As Long as the Grass Grows. That phrase is actually from a lot of treaties. So a lot of tribes, when they were removed from their land, the treaty language was such that you get this land as long as grass grows. And given the mistrust in the government, there was a shit ton of concern for making sure that literally grass was growing so that you didn't get that treaty violated. It's a similar thing. I have people ask me all the time, like, what is the preferred term? Is it Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, and all those things? And I always say, I don't fucking know. Like, I know my grandma always grew up as being an Indian, and that's what my family calls ourselves. But I'm not concerned typically if someone calls me something, obviously not racist. But there is kind of a move or a sect of Native academics who are trying to make that, like American Indian, be the term, because all the treaties are written about the Indians. And the concern is if you start identifying as Native or Indigenous, that'll be enough for a government agency to be like, ha, not Indian, no more treaty. And so there is dispute here, but like, I think it's fine if you just ask people nicely. But yeah, all this is more focused on broader concerns than pipelines about kind of the core values and the things that are driving and why land is so important to Indigenous people. Next, on the tails of the Green New Deal, there was a book published by a collective of Indigenous academics and activists called the collective is called Red Nation, and the book is called The Red Deal. It just kind of lays out here are some principles and demands and guidance for action, but it does a good job of explaining the interconnectivity of all this. So if you're really concerned about ending environmental harms, you should also be concerned with feminist issues and race issues and identity politics and those kinds of things, because the root values that are driving discrimination in those other fields are likely the same things, dominance, that are driving environmental concerns and harms. And so this tries to lay out, here are a bunch of different seemingly unrelated things that people should strive for if you're concerned with environmental issues and things like that. And then lastly, there's a book, As We Have Always Done, by Leanne Simpson. It's more abstract and philosophical, but she talks a lot about tribal histories and, again, the values that go into resistance movements and how those things have all operated. I've got two more, but I wanted to save those for last because I got quotes from them that I liked. I'm also pointing this up because I think both of these, I'm hoping provide more optimism because I think they disagree with the argument that I was making. And so I don't know if this was a very popular book, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you haven't read it, you should. It's fantastic. But one of the claims in there is, for all of us, becoming Indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it. Seems like a nice thought. My concern is I don't know what it means to say that you can become Indigenous to a place if you're not Indigenous to a place. My guess, though, given the rest of the book, is that is just a beautiful way of speaking, because most of the book is very well written. It's a beautiful read, but it is aimed more at motivating people to get interested in ecology and kind of understanding ecosystems and appreciating the complexity. So like, as an exercise in humility, this book talks about a lot of things that we know so little about, like why walnuts sprout at the same time and how the strawberries work. And so if any of that sounds interesting, you should read that. And then the last book is Red Alert by Daniel Wildcalf. I thought about starting the presentation off with this because I think one of the things he says is kind of the driving points that I mentioned. The most difficult changes required to address climate change and other climate catastrophes are not those of physical, material, or technological character, but changes in worldviews and generally taken for granted values and beliefs that are embedded in modern Western influenced societies. So that's the part where I'm like, yes, absolutely. That is the thing that I agree with. The web of life, so that claim we are all related, if taken seriously, implies that human intelligence must be framed in the context of learning how to live well and sustainably as one small but powerful part of nature, as opposed to strategizing how to manage nature. So it's that very first little bit and that last little bit that I really like. The aim here isn't or shouldn't be, how can I best manage my surroundings or control them to best enhance my ability to live well, but what can I do to integrate as part of my surroundings? And then what kinds of responsibilities do I then have in that case? Now, like, one last thing. As I mentioned, this stuff is very confusing for me because the translation issues involved, and I also don't like being a pessimistic person. But just as an illustration of, I think I got this mistrust from my grandma. She was she was in one of the boarding schools. And so when she went away to boarding school, when I was growing up, she told me the only word that she remembered of our tribe's language was Wagus, which meant stop. And the only reason I remember that is because they would hit her with rulers if she ever spoke our tribe's language. And I was like, that's a sad thing to remember. And it kind of makes sense. But then later in her life, something weird happened. She eventually moved back to Oklahoma. And she's always been a Christian, which I found weird, given that the school that was doing these horrible things to her was a Christian institution. But she was able to find a church in Oklahoma, a Methodist church, that did services entirely in our tribe's language. So like in her 50s and 60s, she eventually regained and relearned most of the language because they had Bibles that were completely translated and hymns that were translated. And so it was this weird source of this thing that had been used to discriminate you was now the thing that gave you a stronger connection to your culture. And that kind of trauma that I assume she was reconciling with, I have no idea how to try and process that. But one of the things that she ended up pointing out was in our tribe, the totality of energy, like I was saying, like all things are connected. There's a word that identifies all the energy in existence, and it's Ibafunga. And that means something like the most sacred being in all of existence. Ibafunga typically works through, like peers through or operates through 4 assistants, so like the 4 elements, and the main one being the wind or air. And so that element, that, for lack of a better term, God got the title Hesagedamise, which translates the giver and taker of breath. And so the thought was that when you make prayers, you do not address Ibafunga because that is the most sacred thing in all existence, and it's too busy, and yeah, it doesn't give a shit about you, and you're like, I really hope the Vikings win the football game, like that kind of stuff. So instead you address prayers to one of these other elements, and most oftenly Hesagedamise, the giver and taker of breath. And then the prayer through the air gets taken there, and then through Ibafunga, and it does work there. Translating that, however, into the Bible became a fiasco because given God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit thing, there was no direct translation for these 4 elements and this most sacred being in existence. And so instead of having God translated as Ibafunga, given that you're supposed to pray to God, God got translated as Hesagedamise. And so that became like the version of God in the Bible. And I remember my grandma just being like, yeah, I mean, we all know that's just not how it works, but like there were these weird conceptual tricks that they were doing to make that make sense. And so part of my concern with doing all this is the conceptual tricks that are involved are very dangerous. And so understanding reciprocity, harmony, humility, gratitude, love, how all those things work in different systems without cross-contamination or risking moving one from the other is one of the biggest things that I find difficult. And so I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible. I just don't know if it's possible to do this kind of argumentation and research with doing that. So that's all I have. Whoops, hold on. One more slide. There we go. That's pronounced Mado. That's in Muskogee's language. The V sounds like a U, like in butt. And D, when it occurs between 2 vowels, takes on a D sound. But in my language, tribe's language, that just means thank you. So thank you. I don't know if I could do anything now.
Thank you, Joey. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, then those of us who are on Zoom can see you and see others. Thank you very much for sharing your work and your thinking and your culture with us. Please handle discussion, question, and answer any way you'd like. Cool. It may be that if there are questions in 255A, you may have to repeat it for those of us who are on Zoom to hear.
Okay. Can you all hear the laptop okay? Brad, I don't know why I said the laptop. Cool. Megan, I thought you might have had a hand up, but I'm not sure. Did you have a question by chance? If not, that's
I
okay.
didn't, but I'm happy to jump in, start the discussion.
Oh,
This was so fascinating. So thank you so much. I'm really glad I was able to see this. It has me thinking a lot because my area is communication. So thinking so much about how different concepts are translated, where there's overlap, where there's differences in understanding. So there's this interesting theory called language convergence, meaning divergence, that I've been working with, where our language may converge around certain terms like harmony or reciprocity, but the meanings that we associate with them, right, depends so much on our context of how we grew up and who's in our family, who's in our community, who we work with, etc. And so, yeah, I don't know, the optimistic and the skeptical arguments that you ended up making, and thinking about my role right now as a new mom, raising a child and trying to incorporate some of these concepts into our day-to-day, and realizing how impossible it is, even with all the best intentions and wanting to do things that I think would help her connect to our world differently than how I was raised. But I don't have a community of other folks necessarily that are doing the same thing that I'm doing. So yeah, I want the optimism to be a thing, but I am certainly more skeptical.
no, that makes sense. I always feel bad about the skeptical stuff and being pessimistic. But a part of me, this is just how I justify feeling that way. I also think it's important to focus on though, because I think a lot of times ill thought out or overly ambitious or other things can be inconsiderate, and then you end up causing more harm than good. And so in particular, I think I know this is a thing that's going on right now. Do you all know what pretendian means? So like it's in academia right now. There's been a big, I can't remember her name. This was years ago. There was a woman who had a job at the NAACP and claimed to be Black. Yes, that one. Thank you. So I remember when that story broke my family, and all of my like Native friends were just like, okay, like people do that shit all the time with Native identities, and it's never like a giant news story. And so part of the concern was what's going on in academia now is there are a bunch of people who claim to be Native academics, and they're being called out because they're either not enrolled in a federally recognized tribe, or they don't have documentation to show the history. And part of the concern with that is most of the natives I know aren't concerned with that kind of thing, because there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't be enrolled. And so like I have a friend whose mother is enrolled, but she's not, because they cut off the blood quantum at like half or something. But she grew up in the culture, she's got the history. It's just for whatever reason, it might have to do with allocating resources or distributing funds. Those kinds of things don't happen. Or if you know what disenrollment is, there like a few years ago, tribes were starting to cut off people who had been members their whole lives. Part of it was motivated by greed, because some tribes will distribute like profit from the casinos. And if you just cut a whole bunch of people, that's less people for the profit to be distributed to. And so there was a concern with like disenrollment and all these things. But part of the concern is when white people start focusing on the pretendian thing, it starts to ignore the complexity and the history of these kinds of issues. And I know plenty of Indigenous people who are like, I know that person, they're Native. I know why they're not enrolled. Like their father appeared white, adopted white identity to avoid persecution. That's why they don't have enrollment. That doesn't make them less Indian, but more often than not, when this kind of happens, it then starts removing people who are Indigenous just without the papers from academic positions. And it just seems like another colonizing practice or white way of like cutting off access to like Indigenous spaces and things like that. Yeah.
Actually, that's a question that I had in general. Like, so we actually, both of us are on the OAP program at the REC. So we do a lot of land acknowledgements. We just went down to New Gorge in West Virginia, so we're trying to do a lot of research into the tribes that were popular in the area. According to West Virginia state, there weren't any.
Okay.
Yeah, so don't believe that. But so when it comes to, you know, people that are claiming not necessarily verifiable lineage, and also just not being able to contribute to a larger dialogue, how much of that do you think is the result of present versus past tense when referring to indigenous populations? Because a lot of the research that I've done refers to this tribe was,
Yeah.
and there are elements of these tribes that are still very much alive today.
Yep.
So how much of that do you think is the result of that type of language being used? How do people go about rectifying that type of dialogue when it comes up in conversation?
Gotcha. Were you able to hear that? Kind of, so I'm gonna try and redo the question. I think it was that how much of a role does language have, past tense and present tense or future tense, in causing some sort of discrimination or unrecognition of tribal existence, either contemporary or in the past? Is that about right? Yeah. So it's hard to say. I'm always appalled, I don't ever say this in class, at how little students know about anything indigenous. And so if I go into a class and I ask like, what is the Trail of Tears? There's like a few hands of people being like, it was a removal. And I'm like, from where to where? Do you know when it happened? Do you know what tribes were involved? And there's nothing. And it's a little upsetting, but even if I ask something like in class here, what tribe is indigenous to this land? And no one knows. And even if there's like one person who's like Lenape, I'm like, do you know what tribes those are now though, or where they're located? And the fact that they're referred to now as Delaware Nation of Oklahoma. I think there's like 3 Delaware tribes in Oklahoma, 1 in Wisconsin, Kansas, and like 2 or 3 in Canada or something like that. But they're all descendants of Lenape in this land. And there are groups, I think, around here that try to profit off that, but they have no tribal recognition. And so I know those tribes are concerned about that. I don't know how much the language, like the past and future tense, does there, but I definitely would think it does harm in failing to acknowledge that indigenous people still exist. These worldviews still play out and exist. They just look differently than they might then. And so part of the concern is like, yeah, indigenous practices look drastically different now than they did back then. That doesn't mean they don't exist or that they disappeared, but using things like the tribes that were here, or there's a Lenape woman, Hannah. Does anyone know? With that, like, I think her reputation was the last
Indian Hannah.
Yeah, the
Yes.
last native here or something.
Mhm.
It was, I don't know. I'm new to the area, so I'm just learning about it. But when I read about that, I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, how is that happening? But I imagine like that's a pretty common thing for most places. So, oh, I see. So yeah, I'm not sure, but I definitely think it does more harm than
That's
anything.
what I was wondering, if you think, and maybe people are more apt to claim indigenous history thinking that there's no way to track it down.
I would assume that happens. I think part of the concern too is though using it for profit. And so I know any indigenous person I know has always struggled internally with accepting certain positions that are tied or connected to indigeneity. So like when I applied for the job here, I love my department and everything is great, but they were specifically seeking out people who did either indigenous philosophy or Africana philosophy or Latin philosophy, like some kind of that thing. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I don't know if I'm native enough. Like I'm white passing. I grew up in Minnesota, not on the reservation, even though our tribe didn't have a reservation up until a few years ago because of the Supreme Court. But like that kind of turmoil, I take it to be a pretty good response of indigeneity. So when I see someone who has no self-doubt or insecurities about their indigenous identity in indigenous spaces, immediately to me, I'm like, something's up. Like that seems like a necessary condition for being indigenous, is there's some concern or humility about like, I know there are like, in my case, my dad looks a lot more native than I do. And so I remember one time we were at the Mall of America in Minnesota, and I had a hoodie up and I was walking around, and a cop stopped me and asked me to take off the hood. And I was just like, all right, whatever. And I did that. And my dad was like, the fuck was that about? And I was like, oh, Dad, what are you doing? And he talked to the cop, and then afterwards, I could hear him say to the cop, is it because he's not Anglo enough? And the cop's like, well, no, it's just that store has a hoodie policy. And so my dad was like, all these other people in hoods, they're fine. He's like, well, they're not, if they go into that store, they can't. I was like, okay, there's a, but like my dad was like on guard for that stuff. And it was one of the first times I realized like, I don't have to worry about that. Like when I get pulled over by a cop, there's no concern because I have a very light skin tone. And so I got that white privilege just mixed with the indigenous history and things like that. And I think when people fail to acknowledge those kinds of differences, that can be bad. And so when people start adopting fake indigenous identities, I think that's part of it, is like, I want something to latch on to. This is my thing. This will be my source of identity. And like that pretending thing, it happens, but I think trying to police it as white people ends up doing more harm than good. Because I've never, most of the natives that I know don't do that. Like if I tell someone I'm indigenous, there's not a pushback like, show me your tribal enrollment card or your blood quantum. The only time that has happened to me before, but it's only been white people. And so it's one of those things where I think indigenous people understand the complexity of those issues more. So it's not as big of a push to do that. But like I do have friends who are leaving certain academic positions and jobs because they're like, I don't have status. There are people calling people out. I could get fired. My reputation could be tarnished. So I'm just going to back off this kind of work for a while until things cool down. And it's just kind of a sad thing. Yeah.
Joey, I'm sorry, could I say one thing and then go to your question?
Yeah.
We're a little after 9:50. I'm sorry, 12:50. And generally we pause at this point because sometimes people have to leave to get to another class. So we just want people to feel comfortable logging off or leaving if you have to. But Joey, if you're available to continue the conversation, for those of us who can stay, we'd be very happy for you to do that.
I could do like 5 more minutes, I think, and then I got a whole ass to office hours, but yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you anyone who has to leave. Yes.
I have an easy quick question.
Okay.
So I want to reference the fact that I have absolute zero in American identity. Okay, so that's important. So I work with the Delaware Tribe Historic Preservation Office.
Okay.
And I am working on creating a GIS database for their ancestral lands because they don't have them. They don't have, like, GIS is really important in white spaces and a bunch of government spaces, but there's no database with the native tribes lands. Where, for example, Fort Pennsylvania was named something different previously, so there's no mapping that has those indicators, right? And I'm often feeling like impoverished while doing this mapping because I have no identity with them, and I often feel bad being the one, like they want me to manage the database and manage all of these things, which I can do from a GIS perspective, but like, this is an ethical question, so should I feel bad being the person that's managing this? Because I often do.
I want to be clear. I study ethics. That does not mean I'm good at answering ethical questions or that I'm a good person. My guess, though, is if they're asking you to, that's okay. I think it only becomes an issue if people are overstepping their boundaries or assuming too much or trying either directly or indirectly to kind of claim that identity. But like to do a lot of like, I mean, tribes lack a lot of resources and are very impoverished in a lot of areas. I assume any help that they can get from allies, if they're seeking it, is good. And having open communication and being honest, like, here's what I want to do, how can I help, and making yourself available. I don't know why that would be a bad thing. And I also assume if anyone came up to you, and I don't know who would do this, but like, you're native, you wouldn't say yes.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there's any like risk there of the kind of pretendian stuff or the ignoring histories and cultures and things like that. But
Yeah, like so far,
Yeah.
like I probably will face pushback at some point. It's just like how to manage them.
so I know there are a lot of white people who work with my tribe and things like that. And part of it is like the kind of expertise and training you need to do certain things, like the GIS, I assume is like this, but that kind of technological training and know-how, the population of Indigenous people who are getting access to college degrees and stuff like that isn't great. And so if they don't have people to do that, they're going to have to find elsewhere. I think the hope is just making sure they're finding someone who's not overstepping boundaries and understands like what's going on here. And it sounds like in this case that's happening. So
Through Heather, there's a program for people, paid people for internship program.
Yeah. Oh, I do remember the stuff, yeah. I'm not sure if there's, I don't know the answer to your
I
question.
bet she was for people from the Delaware tribe and nation and classes this summer.
she set up, so I know Heather a little bit, but yeah, she had run a summer program that was taking citizens of Delaware Nation to get them certified to be able to do certain kinds of work for the tribe. And so I think that's what the summer grant was for, was giving them the training so that they could go back with the tribe and do that kind of work. But like, I'm gonna weird analogy, like, do you all know Reservation Dogs, the TV show? If you don't know, it's
Amazing show. Amazing show. I was
yeah.
gonna actually mention that. I'm sorry to jump in. I know you have to go, and I just want to get this out there before this ends completely. I'm Sean. I'm an alumni of Westchester, and I just wanted to raise the question: has Westchester ever considered doing a land acknowledgement for the Lenape, or is there a movement to get them to other universities do that? The University of Washington is a good example. I think Westchester, I mean, I'll go on record and say that I think they should. I don't know if there was ever an attempt to get the admin to do that or not, or
Story, Sean.
Yeah, I can't fully recap. I have talked to Heather about it. There
Yeah.
was, it did not go well. I think they're still trying
The
now.
only acknowledgement that we have put out just last month is we created signage now at the Fort Natural area.
Yeah.
And the signage puts the Lenape word for different plants, trails, that kind of stuff first. I actually made a map for that podium, and so the legend, right, so the name for, I'm not gonna try and pronounce it, but the name for trail is the Lenape word for trail, and then trail is in parentheses. The point being, for once, they're not the ones in the parentheses.
Yeah, so there's a history. It tried to happen. It did not go well, and I think the reason it didn't go well is because the administration worked with a group that claimed to be Lenape but had no connection and runs a website that sells Lenape things, and so it was a profit kind of issue. And so they were getting input from someone who was not actually connected. So now they're working with the Delaware tribes in Oklahoma to better do it, last I heard.
Which Heather had already long established a relationship with, and didn't catch wind of what had been going on until almost too late.
Yeah.
It would have alienated them.
Makes sense.
that's unfortunate. But thank you. You know, you guys are going to get a new president, so maybe that's something to bring up during the screening process. Good to see you, Brad. I have to run. Thank you so much. Really great.
So I know we're running out of time. One last thing, the reason why I brought up Reservation Dogs is there's a doctor in there who's not native who works on the tribe, and that's for a lot of tribes medical centers. They don't have native doctors because there aren't enough doctor or natives who are getting doctor degrees to work back on the tribes. That's a welcome practice though, and it sounds like something similar. Like if a tribe needs something, you got to have someone fill that role. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Joey. We're grateful that you made time to present in the seminar series. And thanks to everyone who has been here in both the online and in-person audiences. Please join us again next week.
Yeah, thank you everyone for showing up. I appreciate it.
Thank you.